The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, stepped up to the defendant's table. The case was minor, a property dispute, but the presence of a Hollywood icon turned the mundane proceeding into an event. Judge Ronald Whitaker, a man known for his sharp tongue and impatience with celebrities, leaned forward, barely masking his smirk. "Mr. Eastwood," he drawled, adjusting his glasses, "I have to say it's not every day we get a cowboy in court. Tell me, are you here to make my day?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Clint didn't flinch. He simply narrowed his eyes and met the judge's gaze, his face unreadable. "Your Honor," Clint said in his low, deliberate voice, "I'd prefer we stick to the facts. I assume that's how things are done in your courtroom." The judge leaned back, clearly amused. Of course. I just hope you're as good at legal arguments as you are at one-liners." Clint nodded. "Let's find out." The case centered around a historic building in Carmel, California, a property Eastwood had restored, only to face pushback from local authorities over zoning laws. Rather than leave it to the lawyers, Clint had decided to represent himself. The city's attorney began his argument, laying out a technical case full of legal jargon. Clint listened patiently, arms crossed, showing no reaction. When it was his turn, he slowly rose from his chair, taking his time. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter," he began. "The law states that historical restorations are protected under local statutes. What I did wasn't a violation, it was a preservation of history. And history matters, doesn't it?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you giving me a history lesson, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint tilted his head slightly, just making sure we all understand what's at stake. He then proceeded to dismantle the opposition's argument with the precision of a master storyteller. He cited legal precedents effortlessly, weaving them into a compelling narrative. He pointed out contradictions in the city's claims, referencing zoning laws with the kind of clarity even non-lawyers could follow. The judge, once smug, now listened intently, his earlier amusement fading. Clint wasn't just an actor playing a role, he was a man who had done his homework. The city's attorney attempted to counter, but Clint was prepared. "Your Honor," he interjected, "if the city truly believed I had violated their laws, they would have enforced them the same way, with every other restoration project. But they didn't. That's called selective enforcement, and it's not just unfair, it's illegal." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge was momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, Judge Whitaker cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, I have to admit I didn't expect you to be this thorough." Clint allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Well, Your Honor, a man's got to know his limitations, and I make sure I know mine." A chuckle spread through the room, but the judge wasn't laughing anymore. He glanced at the city's attorney, then sighed. "I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Eastwood. The restoration stands." Applause erupted in the gallery, but Clint merely nodded in appreciation. He gathered his papers, turned to the judge, and tipped an imaginary hat. "Appreciate your time, Your Honor." As he walked out, the judge shook his head, a grudging smile on his lips. "Damn," he muttered. "He really does know how to make my day." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Clint, microphones and cameras thrust in his direction. Questions flew at him from every angle. How did he prepare his case? Was he planning a career in law? What did he think of the judge's remarks? Clint raised a hand, silencing the frenzy with a simple gesture. "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "Just a guy who believes in standing up for what's right. The law isn't about who talks the fastest or throws around the most jargon. It's about common sense and fairness. Today, common sense won." The crowd cheered as he walked down the courthouse steps, unfazed as ever. The city's attorney hurried past, avoiding eye contact, while Judge Whitaker lingered by the doors, watching him go. With a shake of his head, he muttered to himself, "I underestimated him." One reporter, desperate for a final word, called out, "Mr. Eastwood, what would you say to anyone facing an unfair fight?" Clint stopped, turned slightly, and with that signature squint, he said, "If you're gonna take a shot, you better not miss." With that, he stepped into his car and drove off, leaving behind a courtroom and a judge who would never underestimate him again. As Clint Eastwood's car disappeared down the street, Judge Whitaker stood frozen on the courthouse steps, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a thick fog. The courtroom had been his domain for years, a place where his word was final, his authority unquestioned. But today he had been outmaneuvered, not by some high-priced attorney, but by a man whose sharp mind and unshakable confidence had turned the entire proceeding on its head. Inside, the prosecutor sat slumped at his table, still replaying Clint's dismantling of his case. The reporters swarmed around, eager to dissect every moment of the trial. "Did you see the judge's face?" one whispered. "He thought Clint was just some old actor." Another chuckled. "But the way he handled himself, like he's been in courtrooms his whole life." The bailiff, an older man who had seen decades of cases come and go, leaned over to the stenographer. "You mark my words," he muttered. "Nobody's ever going to forget the day Clint Eastwood walked into this courthouse." Meanwhile, back at his office, Judge Whitaker sat alone, staring at the nameplate on his desk. The arrogance that had once fueled him was gone, replaced by something he wasn't used to: humility. He reached for his gavel, turning it slowly in his hands. With a sigh, he leaned back and chuckled to himself. "Well, Eastwood," he muttered, "maybe the law really is just about common sense after all." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Judge Whitaker found himself replaying the entire courtroom exchange in his mind. He had entered that trial expecting to humiliate Clint Eastwood, treating him like just another celebrity trying to play lawyer. Instead, he had been served a lesson in logic, composure, and an uncanny grasp of the law that had left him stunned. The media was already buzzing. News outlets ran headlines like, "Clint Eastwood schools judge in stunning courtroom upset," and "Justice with a side of grit, Eastwood's legal triumph." Clips of the trial flooded social media, with millions replaying the moment when Clint had calmly unraveled the prosecution's case with surgical precision. At a downtown diner, two young law students sat at a corner booth, eyes glued to a phone screen. "Can you believe this?" one of them asked, shaking his head. "A guy with no law degree just outmaneuvered a sitting judge." The other laughed. "That's not just any guy. That's Clint Eastwood. If there's one thing he's mastered, it's knowing how to handle himself under pressure." Across town, Whitaker's phone buzzed. It was an old friend, a retired judge from another circuit. "Well, well." The voice on the other end chuckled. "Looks like you got taken to school today." Whitaker sighed, but couldn't help but smile. Yeah, he admitted. "I underestimated him, and I paid for it." His friend laughed. "Let me guess, he didn't just know the law. He knew how to present it. That's half the battle in any courtroom." "More than half," Whitaker muttered. He had spent years honing his reputation as a sharp-tongued, no-nonsense judge who could cut down even the most seasoned lawyers. But today, for the first time in a long while, he had been the one left speechless. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood sat at his usual table in a quiet cafe, sipping a black coffee. A few people recognized him, but they kept their distance, watching. In silent admiration, a young man no older than 20 hesitantly approached. "Mr. Eastwood?" Clint looked up. "Yeah?" "I just wanted to say, that was incredible today. The way you handled yourself, the way you stood your ground, it was inspiring." Clint gave him a small nod. "Appreciate it, kid." "Are you really not a lawyer?" Clint smirked. "Nope." "Then how did you do it?" Clint set his coffee down and leaned. "The law isn't just about knowing the rules," he said. "It's about knowing how to read people, how to stay calm, and how to make the truth impossible to ignore." The young man nodded, taking in every word. "I'm studying law," he admitted. "Today was the first time I really felt what it means to stand for something." Clint studied him for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod. "Then you're already ahead of most." As the young man walked away, Clint turned his gaze back to the window, watching the world go by. He had never set out to prove anything to Judge Whitaker, the prosecution, or even the cameras that had captured every second of the trial. He had simply done what he always did, stood his ground, spoken the truth, and let the chips fall where they may. And in the end, that had been enough. As Clint Eastwood finished his coffee, his phone buzzed. It was his longtime friend and lawyer, Jack Reynolds. "You really shook up the legal world today, Clint." Jack said with a chuckle. I just got off the phone with 3 different legal analysts. They're all calling it the most unexpected courtroom moment of the decade. Clint smirked. Wasn't trying to make headlines, Jack. Just didn't feel like getting pushed around. Well, you did a hell of a lot more than that, Jack replied. Even some judges are admitting you exposed the flaws in how they approach justice. That's not something they like to talk about. Clint leaned back in his chair. They should. A courtroom isn't about ego. It's about the truth. Some people forget that. Jack sighed. You know, I've been doing this for 30 years and I've seen seasoned attorneys crumble under pressure. You handled yourself like a pro. You ever think about actually becoming a lawyer? Clint chuckled. Nah, I prefer my kind of justice. Jack laughed. Yeah, I figured. But if you ever change your mind, I'd take you as my co-counsel any day. As Clint hung up, he noticed a couple across the cafe whispering and glancing in his direction. Finally, the husband mustered up the courage to approach. Mr. Eastwood, he said nervously, I just wanted to say that what you did today was incredible. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for every person who's ever been steamrolled by the system. His wife nodded. The way you handled that, Judge, I've never seen anything like it. Clint gave a polite nod. Just did what needed to be done. The husband hesitated. Do you think the legal system will change because of this? Clint took a deep breath. Change is slow, but sometimes all it takes is one moment to remind people what real justice looks like. If that happens, then maybe today was worth something. The couple nodded, thanked him, and walked away, leaving Clint to his thoughts. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, but something felt different. He could sense it in the way people looked at him, in the way conversations lingered, just a little longer than usual. He hadn't just won a courtroom battle, he had sparked something bigger, and as he stepped out into the night, one thought lingered in his mind. Sometimes the best way to fight for justice wasn't with a badge, a gun, or even the law itself. Sometimes all it took was standing up, speaking the truth, and refusing to back down. As Clint stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt the weight of the day settle in. He had faced down tough adversaries before, on screen and off, but something about today felt different. This wasn't just another fight. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun or a fist, it was the truth. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Jack. It was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering. Eastwood. A deep voice came through the line. Mr. Eastwood, this is Judge Harrington from the State Judicial Review Board. I saw the footage of today's hearing. Clint's brow furrowed. That so? Yes. And I have to say, I haven't seen someone dismantle judicial arrogance like that in a long time. Your argument was airtight, your composure was remarkable, and frankly, you embarrassed the hell out of Judge Langley. Clint smirked. That wasn't my intention. I just wanted a fair hearing. Well, you got more than that. We've received multiple complaints about Langley's conduct over the years, but no one's ever challenged him the way you did. You exposed something bigger today, and that's why I'm calling. Clint remained silent, waiting for the man to continue. We're opening an investigation into Langley's rulings. If you're willing, we'd like to speak with you as a key witness. Clint exhaled slowly. He had walked into that courtroom expecting a fight, but he hadn't expected to set off a legal firestorm. I'll think about it, he said. Do that, and know this, what you did today mattered. A lot of people saw it, and they won't forget it. As the call ended, Clint slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't looking for a crusade, but sometimes the fight found you whether you wanted it or not. He turned down the quiet street toward his car, the neon lights of the city reflecting in the rain-slicked pavement. The night air was cool, crisp, filled with possibility. Tomorrow the headlines would be everywhere. Pundits would dissect his words. The legal world would be buzzing. But Clint Eastwood, he'd be exactly the same, unshaken, unapologetic, and ready for whatever came next. As Clint slid into the driver's seat of his old reliable pickup, he took a deep breath. The events of the day replayed in his mind. The sneering judge, the laughter that had turned to stunned silence, The way the courtroom had shifted when they realized he wasn't just some washed-up actor playing legal dress-up. His hands gripped the wheel as he turned the key, the engine roaring to life. He could feel it now. This wasn't over. The call from the Judicial Review Board confirmed it. Langley had made enemies before, but now, with the world watching, his unchecked arrogance had finally met its match. As Clint pulled onto the main road, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Jack. "You're all over the news, Clint," Jack said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "They're calling it the courtroom smackdown of the decade." Clint chuckled. "Didn't go in there looking for a show, Jack, just wanted justice." "Well, you got more than that," Jack replied. "Langley's been put on temporary suspension while they investigate his past rulings. You just might have ended his career." Clint didn't respond right away. He wasn't the type to gloat. He just did what was right and let the chips fall where they may. Jack continued, "You should see the reactions online. Half the country's hailing you as a hero and the other half, well, let's just say the usual suspects aren't too happy." Clint smirked. "Guess that means I did something right." He drove in silence for a few moments, the city lights blurring past him. Then Jack spoke again, his tone more serious. "Listen, Clint, you ever think about doing more with this? People respect you. You've got a voice and now a hell of a platform." Clint sighed. "Jack, I've spent my life telling stories. That's what I do. I'm no politician, no activist." Jack chuckled. "You didn't have to be either of those today, and look what happened. You stood up, you spoke the truth, and people listened." Clint shook his head. He wasn't looking for a crusade, but Jack wasn't wrong. Sometimes the fight found you. As he reached the outskirts of the city, the road stretched out before him, dark and quiet. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: he'd be ready for it, because Clint Eastwood had never backed down from a challenge, and he sure as hell wasn't about to start now. As Clint drove into the quiet countryside, the hum of his truck was the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The road ahead was long, but his mind was still back in that courtroom. Every word, every smirk from Langley, every stunned expression when the tide turned. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. He debated ignoring it but decided to pick up. "Eastwood," he answered gruffly. A deep voice responded. "Mr. Eastwood, this is David Holloway from the Federal Bar Association. I wanted to personally commend you on what happened in court today. Judge Langley has been a problem for years. What you did, it shined a light where it needed to be." Clint remained silent for a moment, letting the words settle. "Just did what any decent man would do," he finally said. "Maybe," Holloway admitted, "but not every man has the guts or the brains to do it in front of a live courtroom and a national audience. Listen, I know you're not a lawyer, but the way you handled that case, have you ever considered using your influence in a more official capacity?" Clint smirked. "Let me guess, you want me to run for office?" Holloway chuckled. "Not necessarily. But the system needs more people like you. Straight shooters. People who don't just play by the rules but understand why they exist in the first place. You made a lot of powerful people take notice today. Clint, if you ever want to use that platform for something bigger, there are doors that can open for you." Clint let out a low sigh, his fingers drumming on the wheel. He'd spent a lifetime making films about justice, about righting wrongs. Today he hadn't been acting. And yet the idea of diving deeper into the real thing. "I appreciate the call, Holloway," Clint finally said, "but I'm not sure I'm the politician type." "You don't have to be a politician to make a difference," Holloway replied. "Just think about it, and if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." The call ended, leaving Clint with nothing but the open road and his thoughts. Maybe today had been a one-time thing. Maybe he'd just been in the right place at the right time. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. One thing was for sure. Whatever came next, Clint Eastwood would face it the only way he knew how. Head on.